Hello, lovelies. Today we are taking a look at the 2014 kind of a sci-fi romance horror film. It's called Spring. It runs roughly an hour and 49 minutes, and it does get off to a bit of a slow start, but if you're willing to stick it out, it does pull you in. It's a very interesting story. I enjoyed it. This is actually a film I have seen numerous times, and in my opinion, it is a slow start. It's not necessarily a horror film in the traditional sense, but more kind of a horror because there is reference to primordial creatures. So we have a young man named Evan who, shortly after losing both of his parents, decides to travel to Italy, where he makes quick friends with two other guys, and then he runs across a young woman named Louise. So this is pretty much where our story is focused. She kind of pushes him off. She's not really interested in him, and he continues to pursue her, and he's not really pushy. It's kind of interesting, just kind of their little interactions. He also works as an olive farmer or an apprentice. He's somewhat of an illegal immigrant. He has chosen to stay in the country because he is interested in this young lady. So that's fairly interesting to me, but it's a pretty good story. It's well acted. It does have an odd bit of dialogue. There's a story that Evan tells Louise at one point in the film about a friend of his who had gotten punched out by a woman. Apparently, his girlfriend was seeing another woman, a friend of a friend, and the other lady just stepped in and said, "Hey, this is enough." And apparently the other lady's name was Tiny. Why, I don't know. It's open to interpretation, but I like Louise's reaction to the story. She says, "I like Tiny, but what's the point of this story?" To which Evan just responds, it's just a funny story. So it's kind of just little weird quirks like that. She's definitely an interesting lady. As I said, she's kind of standoffish, a bit protective. Not necessarily rude or snobby. There's definitely something about her, and we do gradually discover these points about her throughout the film. So there's a fair amount of foreshadowing. There's a point in the film where Louise asks Evan what he thinks of her, and I forget how the conversation moves in this direction, but he asks her if she's a bit of magic, which is maybe potentially intended to have been flattering. I don't know, but she does give an interesting series of responses here, to which she replies, "I'm half undiscovered science and some crazy hormones and a bunch of confusing biochemistry," which I thought it was a very interesting reply. And for a first time watch, yeah, it's kind of like, what is this girl on about? But if you're familiar with the story, if you've seen it a couple of times, you know exactly that she's being exactly honest with him and very upfront. So she's not really trying to hide anything at all. It just kind of comes off as just very odd. And so everything seems to be running just fine. They're getting along, they're getting to know each other a little better, and then just out of the blue, all of a sudden, she no longer wants to speak to him, and he's just confused. He doesn't really understand why. Of course, unbeknownst to him, earlier that same day, she conducted a ritual in which she later tore a rabbit to shreds with her teeth, and his poor little companion is hiding in the corner of this room just staring in shock. And it kind of sums up how I felt the first time I watched this, because these were little pet rabbits that she seemed to have really cared for, and then this horrific thing happens. And of course later we just get a very brief explanation. It's just that she, in order to maintain her condition, she resorted to ritual or witchcraft, if you will. obviously once they have this falling out, he goes to see her just one last time because he is very smitten with this girl. He cannot help himself. He's in love with her. And this is when we first see Louise in one of her primordial forms. She's kind of this octopus-like creature. The first time the audience themselves get a very brief glimpse that she is different, it's probably within the first 30 minutes or so, and it's not until the 43-minute mark that Evan discovers this for himself. So there's definitely a very big lapse there. The audience at this point knows a lot more than the hero, if you will, and he's not really shocked or scared. I mean, there's definitely this sense of surprise, and he grabs her syringe and he gives her dose, which brings her back to a human state. So here's where we find that she has kind of a condition which, very summed up, very paraphrased, she's not immortal, but she is able to live for a very long period of time. So she can remain within the state of the appearance correction. She can live with having the appearance of a 20-year-old for 20 years. And then she has to undergo this metamorphosis all over again, whether it's kind of like her having to rebirth herself due to some sort of a stem cell. In this situation, how it's being done is she is pregnant, and basically what she would have done is she would have absorbed the embryo, all of these new cells being created, and she would have rebirthed herself. So obviously this Evan chap is in love with her, and now knowing that there's a kid, it definitely changes his point of view or his perspective on things. And other than just really, really wanting to be with her, he's kind of trying to convince her, well, is there any way that this thing can work out? And the only real catch in all of this is, say if, I forget how it's described, I apologize, but apparently some chemical that's produced when being in love, if she were actually to be in love with Evan, it would stop her transformation. She would remain in this human state, and she would live out a human life and eventually just die. So this is kind of what he's banking on, not because he wishes her ill, but because he wants to be with her this badly, and he's hoping that she loves him just as much as he loves her. So it's kind of not necessarily unrequited love, because we really don't know exactly how Louise feels about Evan, but we do know how Evan feels about her. And there's just this very hilarious scene in the film, which, if I can just briefly reference an earlier scene in the film, I know I'm jumping around. There's a scene earlier in the film where when Evan first meets Louise, he finds one of her syringes, not really knowing what the deal is. She says, well, no, I'm not into drugs. She says it's due to a medical condition that she has. So while Evan and Louise are traveling together during her last days before her transformation, we find out whether or not she will or she won't. There's a pretty funny scene in a church where they're just kind of sitting in one of the back pews, and she doesn't realize that she has begun to transform again. Evan tells her, yeah, you might want to take something for that. And in the meantime, while she's searching through her bag, she's telling him these stories about when she was younger lifetimes rather. And there's this funny clawed tail that's just hanging out behind Evan, just kind of wanting to strike. And it's funny that none of them really notice this. It's just very nonchalant conversation. She takes her dose, they leave. And my favorite line out of the entire film, an elderly woman who was sitting ahead of them had noticed this. She turns around and her husband is asking her, what in the world is going on? And she says, I saw a zombie taking heroin. I just thought it was so hilarious, but just very minimal, but it's one of my favorite scenes in the film. But I will leave it there for you. I don't want to spoil it if she does or doesn't change, or if the story works out well. It's not a bad story. It's really good. I would encourage you guys to to watch it. Once again, it does have a very slow start. One of the things I did notice about this is in the beginning of the film, it has like a lot of yellowy or brown tint, and maybe it's just more reflective of Evan's mental state. Obviously, he's lost both parents, so he maybe just doesn't feel very well, just kind of giving the audience that sense of sickliness and that he leaves to go somewhere else to feel better. And it's true, once he arrives in Italy, the colors become a lot more brighter, a lot more welcoming, very crisp, very beautiful. But that's just a final thought. This is all I have for you guys for today, and I will talk to you later.